Okay, guys, I'm sort of happy to be talking about this book, History of Western Philosophy, Bertrand Russell. I stole this from my dad many years ago. I've been reading it on and off for, I don't know, almost 30 years, 25, 30 years. And I've been reading a lot of it recently in the last couple of weeks. And the funny thing is, the reason I started reading it was that I always remembered that he had a little chapter in here on Byron. And I was like, after I read the biography of Byron, I'm like, what does Russell have to say about Byron anyway? When I was a teenager and came across the book, and I was sort of offended that Russell put a chapter on Byron. Now it's a chapter at right. It's very short, but I was like, why would he write? Why would he devote any pages to a poet in a book on philosophy? Now, subsequently, there, you know, there's this Penguin history of the church, or Penguin history of, or is it the Pelican history? Anyway, I'll put it up here probably for you. Um, it's like a 4 or 5 volume history of the church or history of Christianity or something, and different volumes were written by different authors, and the Chadwick brothers wrote two of them. Uh, Henry and Owen. I can't remember which wrote which, but it doesn't matter. Anyway, it's an excellent series. Now, one of the more one of the volumes on contemporary Christianity or the contemporary church, I remember had a chapter on Coleridge, and I found that interesting, and so I could think back and say, all right, if Chadwick was was right to put a chapter on Coleridge in his history of the church or whatever, then why can't Russell be right to include a chapter or really a few pages on Byron? Fine, great. So that was the first chapter I read in my rereading or revisitation of Bertrand Russell's history. Um, this is a great book. Um, Now I want to do something, but anyway, I'll say it in a minute. And the question that I want to talk about is who can read this book? Who can read, who can understand this book? It doesn't say an introduction to a Western philosophy. It says history of Western philosophy. And I like that he didn't use any article with it. Like he didn't say the history or he didn't say a history. He said history. And I actually like that. Some of the editions of this book will throw in one of those particles like history or the history, and I want to believe that this is the original title, History of Western Philosophy, because I find a history a little a little pretentious in that it is sort of a humble brag. It's like, oh, this is just a history, right? So it's a kind of a humble brag. It strikes me that way. Whereas the history seems a little bit too definitive. Um, so history, uh, starting without the article, just puts the focus on the history, right? Not the focus on any kind of conclusion you need to draw about the quality of the book, right? Anyway, my weirdness. So, uh, Bertrand Russell, for those who don't know, was a very significant philosopher of the 20th century. He was actually Wittgenstein's doctoral director, I guess. Um, and Wittgenstein and Russell were very important in the development in modern developments of logic. Um, you know, Wittgenstein was more renowned for his work on language, I guess semiotics or whatever you want to call it, whereas Bertrand Russell was key in the development of symbolic logic and so on in the modern world. So um, that was his greatest contribution. I mean, Bertrand Russell is a large figure in 20th century philosophy, and he knew it. but but I mean, and there's lots of stories about him and his large ego, but I found that his ego doesn't come across too much in this history. This history has been criticized by people for Russell relying too much on secondary sources and not enough knowledge of primary sources. Um, I don't find that a legitimate criticism. Um, when you're talking about 2,500 years of philosophy, you're talking about a massive subject matter, and I think Russell, whether he's heavily relying on secondary sources at times, um, I think nevertheless that his accomplishments and knowledge of other uh, parts of philosophy more than justify his reliance, or more perhaps superficial knowledge of other moments. And I gotta hand it to him for a renowned atheist. I find Russell surprisingly sympathetic to theology. Um, the young Colin would have been extremely surprised by that, but uh, I find him refreshingly appreciative of the great theologians like Augustine and Aquinas and so on, and even um, the religious believers who are philosophers, like people like Descartes and Spinoza and so on. And you know what? Or I shouldn't say Spinoza, but Leibniz. Leibniz. Anyway, I think in terms of this book, Russell really shines in dealing with modern philosophy. Now, by modern philosophy, I mean everything from Descartes onwards. That's basically what they call modern philosophy. His knowledge of Spinoza and Leibniz, especially Leibniz, is very impressive. I found his explanation of Kant to be um, remarkable. Remarkable, and Kant is famously difficult, and I found Russell's explanation of Kant's the major points of his philosophy to be very astute and excellent uh, summaries and quite approachable to the non-specialist. Okay, so um, I found it very interesting his chapters on Plotinus and Aristotle. You know, as a logician, Russell has a unique perspective on Aristotle. As you know, Aristotle is basically the father of the philosophy of logic, and Russell's a massive figure in that history as well. So to have one massive figure talk about another massive figure on the subject of logic, which is not something I'm interested in, but nevertheless, it was very interesting to read. Um, so it's an excellent book. Now, here's the question I want to deal with: who can read this book? I have a degree in philosophy. I have an undergraduate honors degree in philosophy, um, and I have obviously graduate degrees in theology, which is very philosophical. And I find this book good. It's exactly what someone like me would want to remind himself about different things. Like I took a whole course uh, on the on Leibniz and Spinoza, um, the what are they called, the rationalists, and those two you can kind of always confuse them together, like um, who is who and all that stuff. And so to remind myself, you read these, brief chapters, 10 pages on Spinoza or Leibniz or whatever. It's very approachable for someone like me. Now, I was wondering if it's approachable for instance, somebody without um, a philosophy degree, and I'm not an expert in philosophy, but I obviously am not an amateur either. So I want to do a little experiment. I'm going to read this book now and see where when the exact moment when you need to have some background starts. Okay, so I'm reading in this volume from page 25, which is the start of chapter 1 of book 1 of part 1 of book 1. Book 1 is on ancient philosophy, part 1 is on the pre-Socratics, and the first chapter is called The Rise of Greek Civilization. um I wonder if that's a good place to start. Maybe if I get to maybe his first consideration of a philosopher. Okay, yeah. So let's start with chapter 2. It's called The Milesian School. And I'm going to read until I have to stop because um, someone who say only taken a course, an introduction to philosophy or whatever, can't go further. Okay. So he starts on page 44. In every history of philosophy for students, the first thing mentioned is that philosophy began with Thales, who said that everything is made of water. This is discouraging to the beginner, who is struggling, perhaps not very hard, to feel that respect for philosophy which Socrates seems to expect. There is, however, ample reason to feel respect for Thales, though perhaps rather as a man of science than as a philosopher in the modern sense of the word. Thales was a native of Miletus in Asia Minor, a flourishing commercial city, in which there was a large slave population and a bitter class struggle between the rich and the poor among the free population. Quote, at Miletus, he's quoting a historian here, at Miletus, the people were at first victorious and murdered the wives and children of the aristocrats. Then the aristocrats prevailed and burned their opponents alive, lighting up the open spaces of the city with live torches. Sounds like Roman history. Anyway, similar conditions prevailed in most of the cities of Asia Minor at the time of Thales. Miletus, like other commercial cities of Ionia, underwent important economic and political developments during the 7th and 6th centuries. So he goes on a bit to describe more of the circumstances, although he's already had a chapter devoted to the rise of Greek civilization. So I'm going to jump ahead a bit. As regards the date of Thales, the best evidence, as we saw, is that he was famous for predicting an eclipse, which, according to the astronomers, must have taken place in 585 BC. Other evidence, such as it is, agrees in placing his activities at about this time. It is no proof of extraordinary genius on his part to have predicted an eclipse. Miletus was allied with Lydia, and Lydia had cultural relations with Babylonia, and the Babylonian astronomers had discovered that eclipses recur in a cycle of about 19 years. They could predict the eclipses of the moon with pretty complete success, but as regards solar eclipses, they are hampered by the fact that an eclipse may be visible in one place and not in another. Consequently, they could not know that at such and such a date it was worthwhile to look out for an eclipse, and this is probably all that Thales knew. Neither he nor they knew why there is this cycle. Thales is said to have traveled in Egypt. I suppose I should say traveled to Egypt. Well, I guess you have to go. You can go in, but you have to be there too first, and to have thence brought to the Greeks the science of geometry. What the Egyptians knew of geometry was mainly rules of thumb, and there is no reason to believe that Thales arrived at deductive proofs, such as later Greeks discovered. He seems to have discovered how to calculate the distance of a ship at sea from observations, taking at 2 points on land, and how to estimate the height of a pyramid from the length of its shadow. Many other geometrical theorems are attributed to him, but probably wrongly. He was one of the 7 wise men of Greece, each of whom was specially noted for one wise saying. It is a mistake to suppose was water is best. According to Aristotle, he thought that water is the original substance out of which all others are formed, and he maintained that the earth rests on water. Aristotle also says of him that he said that a magnet has a soul in it because it moves the iron. Further, that all things are full of gods. The statement that everything is made of water is regarded as a scientific hypothesis, and by no means a foolish one. 20 years ago, the received view was that everything is made of hydrogen, which is two-thirds of water. The Greeks were rash in their hypotheses, but the Milesian school, at least, was prepared to test them empirically. Too little is known of Thales to make it possible to reconstruct him at all satisfactorily, but of his successors in Miletus, much more is known, and it is reasonable to suppose that something of their outlook came from him. His science and his philosophy were both crude, but they were such as to stimulate both thought and observation. Okay, so I suppose what I've proven so far is that this book is quite approachable to the uh, to the amateur, to someone starting out in philosophy. I think that, for instance, someone might miss the implications of Thales defining water as basically the fundamental fact of the universe, um, because the way that different of the pre-Socratics, or the philosophers that preceded Socrates, they all sort of fastened on one element, saying this element is the fundamental element. And I think that, and Aristotle in his Metaphysics gives a very short history of these things, which is what Russell's quoting here, or yeah. So um, Miletus, Asia Minor, Lydia, you can look up these things, and the fact is that most of the pre-Socratics didn't come from Greece as we know it today. They came from the Greek colonies in Asia Minor. Um, Fine, great. Um, and that only one or two of the pre-Socratics were actually from the Peloponnesus, or the mainland Greece as we know it today. So I guess this is me saying that I think just about anyone, say with a high school diploma, could make a stab at this book, I suppose. I'm assuming that first chapter will build up on second chapter and build up on third chapter and fourth and so on. So that by the time you get to, say, Kant or whatever towards the end of the book, you'll be in a pretty good position to make sense of it. Um, so that's what I'm going to go with. I'm going to say that so far, until I'm forced to make another video and say, no, I was wrong. I think so far we can say, yeah, you can use this as an introduction to philosophy too, although that's not what it's presented as. So until then, uh, if you want to start reading about philosophy as a coherent history, then try Russell's book. It's been printed in innumerable editions, and it seems to stand the test of time. Yes, there are other histories of philosophy out there, but the fact that Russell is still being printed almost 100 years after he originally wrote it, I'm guessing that this was finished maybe in the 50s. He refers to the Nazis and stuff, so it's at least... Okay, yeah, so first published in 1946. And it seems to be republished every couple of years. So you're definitely going to find a copy of it. I see it in every bookstore I go into, whether it's a used bookstore, a specialist bookstore, or a Chapters or whatever, Indigo Chapters. You're going to find this book. It's in every philosophy section of every mainstream bookstore. I recommend it. It's excellent. And Russell has a very precise mind, and I think he is suitably objective. He criticizes every philosopher, and he appreciates every philosopher in one way or another. So there you go. What more could you want in a overview, in a textbook, in a history book? So there you go. So Anyway, I hope you've enjoyed this video, and I'll pat myself on the back that I made 2 videos in March, I guess March 28th, so before the change of the month, and I'll try to do some more as soon as I can. So thanks everybody. Hope you have a good day, good night, and good Easter. I guess we're almost a week and a half away from Easter. So, and happy spring. Isn't it great? The weather's warming up, except you in the southern hemisphere. I'm really sorry. Okay, I'm being silly.